All right, so I'm Wes Rogers, Kansas City Councilman running for mayor. This is our first ever episode, and I'm really excited about it. So, would you introduce yourself?
I'm Valerie Hughes. I'm a licensed professional counselor in private practice, specializing in human sexuality. I am also an adjunct professor in human sexuality, counselor supervision, and substance use.
So, are you from there? Yeah.
I actually grew up about an hour south of Kansas City in Bucyrus, Kansas.
Okay. Exactly where Bucyrus is. Yeah.
Between Lewisburg and Stillwell, right?
Right.
Very importantly located.
Forward. Generally speaking, tell us about your work. What does your day-to-day look like?
So I'm in private practice, which means I typically see individuals and couples, and my days are usually seeing clients and taking notes. When I teach, I am also committing like an extra 15 hours to reading and researching and developing coursework for my students.
My mom is a therapist, so I grew up, is what you do when I grew up, and I always had such appreciation for the work. It just seems from the outside, it's just, obviously it's important, but it just seems really hard.
So what was one of your favorite things you learned from having a therapist parent?
I've never really thought about that. I would say, it's important to listen to people, right? I like to believe that she was a good listener, and
Yeah.
I've tried to copy that as best I can.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Okay, so you learned active listening from your mom, most likely.
Probably, yeah. So what drew you to this line of work?
I got really lucky, and my first psychology class was just an undergrad intro to psych class that was taught by a husband and wife, both working in the field. And the husband did research, and the wife was a practicing clinical therapist. And so they talked about the topics from both perspectives in a way that I found so interesting and I really loved. So I think I had this really intriguing introduction to therapy that entwined both the importance of research and the importance of like a warm, affirming clinical space.
Okay. And then you continue to specialize. So how, ending up in human sexuality, what drew you to that specialty?
Okay, so my grandmother was the head nurse at the VA in St. Louis for most of her career. And when I hit puberty, she bought me what ended up being my graduate school textbook in human sexuality,
Wow.
like several editions later, of course. And I remember reading through it and then going to my high school health class where we learned sex ed, right? And knowing more than my sex ed teacher about sex, just because I had read through that book. And I think I sort of became a person that was just like easy to talk to about those kinds of topics. Also, it's just really interesting. So,
Yeah. Well, no, that makes sense. Yeah. And so you've seen in the news recently conversion therapy ban conversation in the city of Kansas. What was your initial reaction when you saw that in the news?
I wasn't really under the illusion that it wasn't happening during the ban. And in my practice, I'll hear people sort of make dog whistle references to things that to me sort of scream conversion therapy, but that's not what they were being told they were receiving.
So let's back up even a little on that. So as an expert, what is conversion therapy?
So conversion therapy is basically this idea that you are going to use usually religion as a means of treating something that, of course, is not a diagnosable mental disorder. Like the threat of like eternal damnation, for example, is very relevant in this kind of discussion. And it's the idea that you're basically, I think my favorite way it's ever been described is providing an erotic amputation. It's not really possible from a biological standpoint. And sexual orientation, when we're talking neurobiology, tends to light up specific parts of the brain, but gender identity especially lights up mostly the entire brain. That is because we understand things linguistically, and the English language, for example, is heavily rooted in gender. And so when we talk about our understanding, we're talking about our linguistic understandings of things, and we conceptualize ourselves through that framework. It's going to affect the way we see the world pretty broadly. The concept of conversion therapy, when we're talking about gender identity from a biological standpoint, is ineffective because you would have to alter every single part of the brain's functioning.
Is it normally going to be somebody who, a kid whose parent is trying to impact them and the parent brings the kid to someone versus conversion therapy, or is it an adult wanting something? How does this get started?
So, according to the Trevor Project, it's typically going to be a person under 18. Usually between 7 and 18 is the bulk of people receiving conversion therapy. One of the things that really surprised me about that is I was looking up the statistics preparing for this. And something, according to the Trevor Project, something like 35% of conversion therapy services are to children between the ages of 7 and 12.
Are you kidding?
And we don't
7?
7 and 12, yes. Very young.
Or
It's very young. And the thing about that is that we do not really understand ourselves have like solidified sexualities until puberty and beyond puberty. I think people develop that identity over the course of most of their lives. So I'm not really sure what the goal is.
and as someone who's not an expert in this, it just but I am a parent, right? It just seems like even going down that route would potentially just cause insurmountable pain and suffering to some kid that's being exposed to this.
The outcomes tend to show higher degrees of suicidal ideation, suicidal behavior, long-term substance use, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I really do think a lot of that comes down to some of the threats associated with conversion therapy, threat to community, right? Significant loss to community. If your parents are terrified that you're going to go to hell, for example, which is why I think most parents would choose this, is that they are genuinely terrified for their child's eternal well-being. When you think about it, as a parent, you would do anything for your kids. It's just sort of rooted in that bias, right? In those situations, you are sort of desperate. And I think it's being a bit exploited.
And I understand what you're saying. It's just, I mean, it breaks your heart to hear it.
I think a lot of parents make mistakes by trying to help their children in ways that they think they should be helped instead of hearing the ways their children would like to be helped.
So do you ever see a situation where parents, and you're being so gracious by parents in their minds genuinely trying to help their children?
Yeah.
Do you ever see parents years later realize that was wrong? I should not have done that.
I think that typically what it ends up looking like, in my experience, and I can think of a few examples, is they process their own bias associated with this and begin to sort of shift it. An example from recent work that I have, a client of mine's parents left the original church that they were in that had sort of these restrictive opinions and has begun attending a church that is more progressive. And like, I think that's one of the lovely things about Christianity, and I don't want to come here demonizing Christianity, is that there is like a very broad concept of like opinion and interpretation of what the Bible is suggesting.
I grew up in a church that's an affirming church, and yeah, it's a broad religion with a lot of different perspectives.
So
on it.
many.
Yeah.
The American Association of Christian Counselors, which I Googled their ethics, they tend to be much less aligned with conversion therapy practices than you would expect. And they tend to be much more aligned with the ethical standards of other counselor professions.
Much broader question here, and I felt like for decades we were going way too slow, but just generally creeping in the right direction of acceptance and of science and of everything that comes with that. And then I feel like the last 5 or 10 years we've just hit a roadblock, if not even maybe gone a little bit backwards. And that's from that side looking in, but I would be curious your perspective on that.
Okay. Personally, I think really it comes down to fear. I would say that this has been kind of an ongoing issue since like 2008, maybe even before. 2008 financial crisis often gets pointed to, right?
Wow. Okay.
When we think about fear against the queer community, we have to think about like fear as a broader concept. The LGBTQ community tends to get scapegoated in that, especially trans people are being scapegoated right now. But really what it comes down to is I think that Americans widely are feeling the financial effects of untaxed billionaires, right? And the money moving upward toward the 1%, I would say is broadly, from my understanding, affecting at least the bottom 90%. When that kind of uncertainty hits us on an individualistic level, we are all looking for answers instead of coming together communally to figure out ways to navigate these things that are maybe creating fear. It is easier for people to lean on biases they may already hold. And I think that that is relevant on both the left and the right, if I'm being honest.
Yeah. I mean, it's an important conversation, and I spent 4 years in the Missouri State Legislature where regular topic of conversation, right? And I never felt like we were listening to the scientists. I never felt like we were listening to the professionals. I never feel like we were listening, most importantly, listening to the people, Missourians who were showing up in Jeff City and telling us about their lived experiences. And we just didn't care. We just wanted to virtue signal and do mean things. And just, we were way less interested in the actual people we impact than making some broad political statement. So that was never, it was crushing. I don't know how else to put it.
Well, I mean, I think about it and I think about like how easily then you were attacked if you go against what your party is maybe pushing, because I had been a part of an email group and a group of therapists that were sending I guess experts to Jeff City around anti-trans legislation.
There for a while that.
Yeah, I did a lot of back end stuff with them. Mostly because I didn't really want to drive. Um,
Did that trip many times. You're not missing.
yeah, exactly. One of the things they would talk very broadly about and like extensively about was like how so much of their conversations with legislators were them explaining these things and seeing the person really like understand in a different way and develop a different perspective, but then continue to vote in the same way because they
Saw it a
think,
million times.
well, I mean, how do you get reelected, right? And so I do find it quite unfortunate that it has become unpopular to believe in science.
Well, much broader conversation. That's also just we've got this binary political system where you've got to, and most of these elections aren't elections that are contested in the November general election.
Hmm.
Most of them are primary elections, right? So you've got this very small subset of the population that is voting in the primary, and these people are
Yeah.
trying to survive, so they do what they have to do, and it gets pretty discouraging. And I will say, and I've heard conversations on both sides of the political aisle on this, where someone would come up to me and say, "Man, that was a really stupid vote," even though they voted for it, right?
Yeah.
And it's just one example of how messy politics have gotten and how absolutely absurd some of the things that we do are. But unfortunately, this was always the hardest issue for me because it impacted real people,
Of
actual
course.
people that are already getting picked on and bullied and treated poorly by all people just constantly every single day, and then they're getting it from their own government. I'm just thinking, guys, time out. We can fight about other things. Let's not just victimize our own constituents here. So I really struggled with that.
I think it would be really hard to be in your position and making those kinds of decisions given that kind of pressure that exists. And I guess I wonder how you make a decision that holds both that like political pressure and sort of your personal um sense of empathy to your constituents, and how do you hold space for both of those things?
Well, for me, and I'm a Democrat, and I generally I'm on the left on most issues, but
I googled
you
here.
know, yeah.
Yeah.
But I also got myself in trouble because I just did whatever I thought made sense, right? So
Mm.
I didn't always vote with the Democrats. Sometimes I voted with the Republicans, and
Sure.
and then you'd catch a lot of crap for that. But
Mhm.
we just that's what you're signed up to do is to do what is right. And if you're out talking to your constituents and you're out talking to voters, you have a pretty good idea of where your neighbors are on issues, and
Yeah.
and if you know that, then you're going to do an okay job.
Okay, so for you, it comes down to like knowing the people that you're representing and really being among them and
Yeah, for sure.
having this.
I mean, I knocked the first time I ran for state rep, I knocked on 18,000 doors by myself. So I went down every street in the district 2 or 3 times, right? So, and you don't agree with everybody, but that's okay. But you generally have an idea of, well, number one, you know what you believe in. Number two, you know what your neighbors believe in, and then you make your decisions based on that. And if you're actually talking to people both beforehand, and then also just as importantly afterward, even if they don't agree with everything that you do, they're still going to give you another chance because they know that you you're using your own moral compass and the information available to do the best job you can do. So
I agree. I also think that like I agree with that entirely. I originally practiced in Chicago, Illinois. Like I moved here in 2021 or back here in 2021. Um and I think that one of the things that surprised me about the last major election was how many of my friends and colleagues in Chicago were like, I'm not gonna vote this year. because this isn't what I want. And I'm like, no, but in Missouri, we have to accept some compromises to get anything done. Like, you are forgetting about us because you are entirely surrounded by liberals. And like, I think the issue there was really that like it does become a bit of a bubble. And so people are expecting ideal solutions to every single decision. And I don't think that's particularly pragmatic or realistic.
Oh, I'm with you on that.
As far as the conversion therapy ban goes, I think my question is, how do you see yourself negotiating some sort of compromise given that the ban has lifted? And that happened on a federal level, so was inevitably going to happen here.
Oh, 100%. And this is one of the more serious issues, but we see this all the time with either the federal government, the courts do something, we know it's going to eventually make its way down to us. And a lot of times we're on the other side of that decision. So we need to be prepared for it. And
Yeah.
you do the best you have with what you've got. And that's what we're trying to figure out what that looks like right now.
Yeah.
Is there any training for somebody who's performing conversion therapy?
Oh, I'm not really sure.
Well, I'm just curious what that, like, how do you present yourself as an expert on this, or what?
I've looked up one of these kinds of groups recently, and one of the people had like a doctorate in pastoral counseling and stuff, but everybody else was a coach. And but anybody can be a coach, right? Like you could just say that you're a coach. I could say I'm a coach now, which would be legally dubious from a liability standpoint. But at the end of the day, though, I don't have to make any decisions about this beyond I'm not going to do conversion therapy, right? But that's an easy decision for me.
Well, yeah, but I think about teenagers growing up, and it's just hard to grow up no matter what, right? It's just hard to be a teenager.
Yes.
And then you've got your parents who start meddling, and now all of a sudden you're talking to somebody who claims to be an expert who probably doesn't have any real, scientific background on any of this stuff. And then you're already having a hard time being a teenager because everybody does. And then you're getting these adults that are just trying to change who you are. I just, again, as not an expert, I just think, what terrible damage could that do to somebody?
I mean, not great. It's not a great thing. I have like extended family and family friends who are all very conservative. And I don't know what it was, but last year, so many of them came up to me and they're like, Valerie, because they know what I do for work,
Yeah.
right? They're like, Valerie, what's this thing that I've seen about them putting litter boxes in the elementary school bathrooms or the high school bathrooms? And I'm like, oh my gosh. Thank you so much for asking me. It is my favorite because here's the thing is like we get an opportunity to clear up misinformation. And it turns out if you just talk to them in a nice way, they'll usually listen to you. And I'm not gonna lie, it's very easy to get a man to think about his gender differently because every man can answer the question, what is one thing you don't like about being a man? They all know the answer. Like, usually it's that they feel responsible for everything, or they feel like they have to be a specific role that's not always easy to maintain, or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And it's so easy to get them to actually think about why a person might reconsider their gender that I like to do it. It's fun. So
That's genius. Well,
as soon as they come to you and they're like, those litter boxes, you can be like, wow, what's making you say that? Like, what teenager do you think wants to shit out in the open? Like, no teenager. They're all weird about their body.
Right.
Some of them don't want to use the bathroom at all at school.
Okay, so what I love about this conversation is your optimism, able to turn any conversation into an opportunity to teach and to get people to learn.
I think so many people forget that curiosity gets you a lot of places.
Yeah.
It like opens a lot of doors. Most of the time we hear like very offensive things from other people that we believe and know to be offensive. And from that stance, we approach it defensively, instead of from a place of curiosity. The reason that's my favorite game is that I'm like, I actually know exactly what to do here to disarm this particular conversation.
So my dad passed away a couple years ago, but he and I were business partners for years and years. And he was extremely conservative.
Yeah.
And so sometimes we agreed, most of the time we didn't agree, but I could hear everything that was coming from his office, and he could hear everything coming from my office. So I would hear him talking to his friends about politics in the other office. It was fascinating because you feel like you're getting an inside look into how people that don't agree with you on everything, view the world, and it was fascinating. But
Don't you think it's so much, like, rooted in fear of losing something?
they're
Like, there's so much concern of loss.
they're oftentimes mad, and I never understood why they're always so mad. I will tell you that. I said, "Wow, that's pretty good. Like, why why are we so mad here?" But yeah, there was, and he was I mean, generally a jolly guy. But you get to talking about politics, often you would get mad.
I think a lot about it from, like, a trauma standpoint too, which is, like, I would say the internet is a place where you can kind of see this play out really heavily, is that when something happens in the political landscape, you see people's trauma responses play out on social media. So some people get angry and they're like, "I can't believe nobody's posting about this," or whatever. And so they have, like, an obvious fight response, right? Like, they're becoming combative with their own friends and family, but kind of in a void because they don't know what to do with that helplessness. And I would say anger tends to stem from that feeling of helplessness and not knowing what the next step is. And for some people, they'll get stuck in helplessness and they'll sort of wallow in it, and that's a freeze response, right?
Yeah.
Flight would be a complete dismissal or avoidance of the thing that's making them feel helpless. And I find it really entertaining to sort of watch it all play out.
So social media in general, when you're working with your clients, and especially young kids, I would just think social media would be really hard to navigate. I mean, we know it's hard to navigate. That's not a grand statement, but
Yeah.
when you're talking about something like sexuality, and then you can get online and see all of this stuff, and a lot of people being frankly pretty cruel.
Mhm.
I think that would make it even harder to navigate
I think
whatever you're trying to navigate.
Oof, okay. I think social media is really an interesting element of our lives because we are, like, new to it to some degree, or a lot of us are, like, I guess, developmentally new to it.
Yeah, all
Um,
of humanity is new to it, right?
well, I would say that, like, I don't know, I feel like, if I ever have teenager clients, which is kind of rare, I mostly see adults. If I ever have teenage clients, they have, like, knowledge and systems and, like, um, kind of like rules around social media that feel very intuitive when you, like, learn about them, but you're like, "I would never think to do that." And I'm not, like, old, I'm 37, but I'm old enough that I'm like, "I'm too old to know that." Um,
Yeah.
and I think that's very interesting from a social media, like a developmental perspective, because we've had access to it since it started, but it has not been part of our lives. So we don't have the same fluency in it. And like if we consider again language development, our best language development occurs between the ages of 7 and like 15 if we're like learning languages. Otherwise, you just don't really develop fluency in the same way, and I think that's true of social media. But I think social media is a really interesting concept in the therapeutic space because, um, so many people, again, have fear around it. What's gonna happen to me if I disagree with my friends? What's gonna happen to me if I come out to my church community, right? Or on social media, I start dating somebody and I left my church community a long time ago, but are they going to lash out at me because we follow each other on Facebook? You know? And it creates this like new space of fear because it's so easy to like cancel someone with no consequences,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Oh yeah.
And I think that we're all to some degree aware of that potential risk.
Mm. And it's constant though, right? I mean, you say one thing, and then everybody's mad at you, and then it's
Yeah.
throw it bad. Yeah.
It's very quick and very easy to end up on
Yeah.
the shit list on the internet.
Oh my gosh, that's incredible.
I will say that, like, every, like, gay man I know who has money also has a gay man who's, like, either unemployed or underemployed living with him. Like, I'm not even kidding, I feel like in Kansas City, that is the gay roommate situation.
Speaking of housing,
Yeah.
so I'm convinced, we're talking about public safety, you're talking about basic city services, you're talking about economic development. There's only so much that city government can do to impact that stuff. And I am convinced the most direct way to impact all of those things at the same time is through housing. So it's interesting to hear you say that. And whether you're gay or straight or whatever, like everybody needs housing, right? And that makes everyone's lives better no matter what. So, but yeah, the more housing we can have, the people can actually afford to live in. It solves problems.
Oh, yeah. I think, we know that that, like, widely solves problems, but then also, I think one of the other things that I loved about living in Chicago is that I learned a lot about how, housing vouchers impact, marginalized communities differently than, like, what is it? The housing project sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I think that it should also be a matter of, like, how are we, understanding eviction processes? Because marginalized populations, BIPOC populations tends to be more, directly impacted by evictions, even with housing vouchers. And so I think we need to also be considering how we're gonna do that
Mhm.
with that situation.
I'm couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And one thing I do think is we just need to build more housing. That would
Oh,
be
I
a,
mean,
be a really good thing for everybody.
yes. Well, that's what they were talking about in, San Francisco, right? Like, that was a big model for them as far as housing is, like, more housing is just, like, widely beneficial. I also went to a presentation at the Kansas City Public Library, about the, like, housing services systems in Houston, and then I think they developed the system in several other cities. But they were talking about how the main goal is to, get people into permanent housing as quickly as possible. And I think that they basically all of the housing related nonprofits pooled their money to, like, buy and rent units so that people who did not have housing or didn't have access to stable housing could get access as quickly as possible. And so they tried to get people in housing in, like, 60 days or less was their goal, and they ended up being really successful in that. Other ways to help the queer community in Kansas City, I think, would be through probably visibility. I feel like that is always kind of an underappreciated aspect is, like, how do we make Kansas City's queer community more visible in policy decision making? How do we make them more visible in community development spaces?
You encounter somebody who's either going through conversion therapy or has just gotten out of conversion therapy. Yeah, yeah. How can you be a good ally? How can you be a good friend?
Be kind to them. I actually think that, we could all be better friends and allies by, being less defensive around, um, like, other queer people who are, practicing religions. I think one of the things that unfortunately happens in the queer community is there's, like, some degree because there's such a large degree of harm, so I don't wanna minimize that. There's some degree of defensiveness that affects the ways we welcome people who are practicing certain religions into the community, and it's almost like you have to choose and, like, hop between identities instead of showing up with your whole identity.
So one thing I always come back to is we've just not done a great job appointing full boards and commissions. It's City Hall, and that's I mean across the border. Whether you're talking housing, trees, you name it. We just a lot of times we don't have full boards and full commissions, and maybe outreach to the queer community is a way to bring everybody into the decision making process and creating policy because a lot of those boards are doing really important work.
I think that would be a great way, actually, is like, how do you get more queer people involved on the boards? I mean, I know many queer people who love trees
Right.
and who
Yeah.
want to talk about trees for hours,
Hmm.
days, like,
Right.
would do it ad nauseum and have many opinions and thoughts.
You just need
Mhm.
people who are willing to show up to these meetings. Sometimes they're long, even if it's something you care about. Sometimes the meetings are boring,
Yeah.
but we need people invested in that. And the beauty of those boards and commissions is you can pick something you really care about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, like, having space where queer people can ask you kind of how to get there. I think when it comes to like city related boards, if you're asking the average person, they might assume that you have to get elected to them.
Yeah, you're probably right.
And I think it would be useful to maybe put more a little bit more out there as to how do you actually sit on a board for the city.
There's a million different ways to do it, and a lot of them are really important.
Are they never full? Is that a thing?
So a lot of them aren't. Yeah, a lot
That's
just
wild.
and it's a combination of the city needing to do a better job promoting just volunteering and getting on these boards, and it's hard to find people. It really is. I mean, I have an appointment to the Tourism Development Fund board where we've got a pool of money that we can do neighborhood tourism for. So like if you want to do a block party or you want to do an event through a local nonprofit, we've got a pool of money every year that we award to these people, and we get good return on an investment most of the time because you're bringing foot traffic into neighborhoods. It is so hard to find people that serve on boards like that.
Really?
It's really hard. Yeah.
They're like, I don't want to be on the party board.
The party board.
I just have money for neighborhoods to throw parties.
Right,
Like, what?
exactly. You need to find people to be that. That's how hard it is to find people to be on boards and commissions. We can't even find enough people to be on the party board. Yeah, exactly. So we just created the New Americans Welcoming Commission, and that was something that's near and dear to me, and I'm really excited about it. And we will go actively reach out to people from all over, right? Because it's a New Americans Commission, so you want everybody that actually represents New Americans on the commission, and it just doesn't stop there. If we're going to be a representative city for everybody, then we need everybody's voice being heard. Every single board and commission, there's all sorts of important work happening. Why doesn't the entire city get the voice on all of these boards, right?
Yes, of course. Well, I mean, I think really integration is how you make those broader changes that would be helpful for all of these communities. And I think that if the LGBTQ Commission is one of the boards, great, love it.
Yeah.
Definitely important and needed. But then again, like we were saying, why are queer people not on the Trees Commission?
Right.
Like, why is that not happening?
I'm not saying they're not. I'm just saying it's an example of something that
They might be.
we could do, right?
I feel like I might be erasing somebody, and I feel a little bad about that.
But no point taking those. Let's just recruit great people to do this important work.
Yeah, and how might you make recruitment easier?
You got to go to people. You got to sell it, right? I mean, I'm a businessman by nature.
Exactly.
If you got something you believe in, it shouldn't be that hard to go sell it to the community.
You gotta hustle.
100%.
Yeah, and I'm certain that you'll be able to find people because I think that in my experience in the queer community, right, and in leftist communities in general too, like you have so many people with so many opinions about all of these topics, and I think having access to actually involving themselves in those committees could be useful.
No, I very much agree. I can go to the center sometimes more than some of our friends on the left do, right?
Sure.
And it's always, for me, I like talking to Republicans. We just disagree. We argue about it, move on, no big deal. Just agree to disagree and no problem.
Yeah.
When I find myself debating politics with somebody to the left of me, I normally feel guilty about it because I think they're probably right, but I just can't get myself there. So it's not as much. I never enjoyed debating politics with people on the left because I feel guilty. Like I get the argument that you would make on prison. I just don't agree, and then I feel bad about it because you're trying to help people. I get it.
Do you not agree because the solution feels so broad and overwhelming, or that the solution feels too ambiguous and vague?
No, and I would say neither of those things. I would say that if we put way too many people in, we incarcerate way too many people. Hard stop. Completely agree on that.
Fun fact: Cook County Jail, the largest mental health provider in the United States.
I never would have guessed that, but that doesn't. It's a massive jail. That doesn't surprise me that much.
It is very true.
And there's so much correlation between mental health and what we call criminal activity. So I get all of that. But we do have murders. We do have domestic offenders, and a lot of domestic offenders aren't murders, right? They're just people who chose to hit their girlfriend or their wife, whatever. I'm not losing any sleep over them to spending some time in jail, even if it's not up to a felony offense, right? Or I've got a good friend who's very much a leftist, who would abolish prisons and abolish jails, and he and I have debated it. And I always tell him, I say, I feel bad for the first dumb son of a bitch who gets a DWI and wakes up in a mental hospital.
Well, my thing about this is like, first of all, we eliminated the hospitalization system for mental health care, the institutionalization,
One of the worst things we've done.
but we didn't really replace it with anything
Prison and jail.
in prison and jail.
So I'm with you on that. Completely
And
with you.
so first, I think that's like the original or like the initial like point of decision making, right? What are we going to do about all of these people who are in prison for mental health conditions?
Yeah.
And
And that's
so,
one place we probably agree because it's not the right place for people.
but then, like you said, if we're working to decrease crime, we have to like build up all of these systems that support like a better quality of life. And all of the research supports this, right? We're not doing it.
No.
And I think that if we did, how many fewer people would be going to prison for some of these issues?
Yeah, and we're setting people back before they're even born, right? And then they don't get adequate public schools. They don't have very good health care. Mom's got no child care whatsoever.
Yeah.
And then we end up putting people in jail for something that they did later. And that's a system that we created that is not working very well. So I agree with you on that completely.
But I also think that like in the United States have a very deep belief, and I would say this exists on all points of the political spectrum, that that if somebody does something wrong to us, the just thing would be something bad happening to them. And I find that to be really problematic. And it's really related to, well, if I feel hurt, instead of feeling hurt, I want to feel angry and feel good about it. And it's like, it's okay to just be angry that somebody hurt your feelings, but does that mean that you also get to punish them?
So I was a violent crimes prosecutor for years and prosecuted some just travesty, some terrible stuff. And it was amazing to me how often we would go to the sentencing, a family member would testify about the harm done to their loved one or to themselves. And I think they thought that once they testified at the sentencing, this person got sentenced to hundreds of years in prison, that would bring some peace. And I very rarely saw peace after that. Normally I saw people confused that they didn't feel like that brought them peace. And so
That's terrible.
So I hear what you're saying, and I agree that that sometimes people think they're going to get peace from something that turns out not to be true. From other people suffering, even if it's somebody who hurt somebody they love.
Well, and I think the other thing is when we're talking violent crimes, I think so many are not prosecuted. And unfortunately, the ones that are brought for prosecution are like the most often the most severe cases where there's good evidence. And I think a lot of times violence does not come with a lot of evidence. And so those cases are typically thrown out. And also, who are you being violent toward, I think matters in what ends up being brought to a prosecutor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I find that to be one of the primary issues with our judicial system, is that, like, sure, we do prosecute crimes, but certainly not equally. I mean, I would say that the statistics on crimes against women, for example, and I can just speak to that as a woman, right, are abysmal, unfortunately. I mean, like, what is it? 4% of sexual assaults get prosecuted. Cool. And so I really think that, like, if it's to prevent violent crimes, we are unfortunately not doing that. And it's a reaction. We're not preventing anything. The violence happens. It's then what is our reaction going to be? And if it's punishment, fine, I guess that's what we all agreed to. And this is where I become a very pessimistic abolitionist, because then we would really have to reevaluate and redevelop the way we understand our reaction to harm.
I hear you.
If you are going to provide conversion therapy, I actually believe that you should have to disclose that there is no research supporting the efficacy of conversion therapy. It's like a cigarette sticker. Cigarettes cause cancer, right? If we know this to be true and the consumer is allowed to still decide and there is no ban, the consumer should be able to make that decision with their, with full consent of that knowledge. And I don't think that's what's happening when families are going to send their children to conversion therapy. I think those people are like, yes, we will fix this. This will go away. Not that any mental health organization would suggest that gender identity issues or sexual orientation issues are mental disorders.
So this is our first episode of Believe in Casey, and I think it went well. I'm excited to see how everything turned out. So we'll be doing this again. Thank you for being our brave first guest here.
You're welcome. I'm sorry that I got us off topic.
No, that was so much fun. Is there anything you would add that we haven't you asked about or that we haven't talked about yet?
I think the only thing I would add is that I think that people who are seeking conversion therapy are genuinely trying to be helpful, and that most of the time, when we want to be helpful, the way we do harm is not listening to the people who we are trying to help. And I would say that happens more often than not, is that people are trying to be helpful and in fact doing harm.
Makes sense.
That's what I have.
Well, thank you for being here. Thank you so much. To anyone who's been through conversion therapy, I know that can feel isolating and make you feel alone. And I just want to tell you right now in Kansas City, you're welcome.